I'll start with the way I've turned this understanding disability in terms of models, theory, and culture, and I followed the what we decided and on the program, but I really mean it as a basis for discussion, and so I'm interested in your thoughts on this. There's a lot to cover, so what I'm going to probably do is just skip over it and put some pointers really for people. What I intend to cover, first of all, is a bit of the historical background, if you like, to how the social model and models of disability were developed, certainly in terms of the medical model of disability and the social model of disability. I'll probably, thinking about the time, I'll probably take a break there to check with people for question and answers, just to see if there are queries and whether I've explained it clearly. I also want to briefly look at independent living, because I know you have an American partner, and this is a very important development from America that's come across as well to the UK and Europe. Look then at theoretical diversification, postmodernism, ableism, cultural models, and crypt theory, to discuss terminology briefly, and then kind of conclude, if you like, with a few thoughts about disability in the arts, and then have another question and answer session. So that's my plan. I'd like to say before, some of this will be very familiar to some colleagues, and I apologize for that. You will probably sit there thinking, I know all this, but I'm aware that with a very diverse and multidisciplinary group, some of this may be new to people. So I'm keeping it kind of fairly general, as with other presenters. Okay, I'd like to start by thinking perhaps a bit about the difference between models and theories, because this has been important for the social model. They're different. They're not really the same thing. A model is, as I put here, constructed so that we can look at something in different ways under different circumstances. It's a kind of artificial simplification. They don't explain anything. They don't provide us with conclusions, but it's just a way of thinking, you know, if we simplify this, if we put it this way, we put it that way, what would it look like? How could we possibly understand different phenomena? On the other hand, theories are where there's an attempt to provide explanations of complex phenomena. One of the founders in the UK of the disability movement, Dick Finkelstein, states that the social model of disability has provided the disability movement with an invaluable tool, which has strengthened our insight in the struggle for emancipation. So the social model is just that. It's not a theory. It's a model. It's a way of looking at society, and I'll describe it. But before I do, I would like to take a step back and think about where the social model of disability originated from. On the right-hand side of my screen, you can see a picture of a large complex of buildings. They're on a grid system, and they're all the same, large red brick buildings. And this is an institution that I personally am very familiar with. It's called Calderstones Hospital, and it's about 20 miles away from where I live in Lancashire. Before I entered academia, this place, and in fact it was one of 3 in the northwest of England, was very much something that we were concerned with. With the best will in the world, these places do not look like homes, yet in the 1960s, approximately 2,400 people with learning difficulties were living on these wards. And this is a picture that was so across the UK, and is still so across Europe. Institutions were built in the 19th and 20th centuries. They rose at a particular point in time. Most important were things like the changing economy. So we had the Industrial Revolution and rapid urbanization, and big changes and disruptions in the way society was organized. The institutions were built at this time, and they were places where, as we know, people were put. They also, in terms of the culture, society's culture, coincided with the eugenics movement, particularly strong in the 1920s, a concern that the population was not in good health and needed to be strengthened, and we needed to make sure that we had fit people in society. Disabled people were not seen as fit. It also coincided with the development of medicine, and doctors. Basically, there was more money in the economy, and it meant that people could afford to build institutions, and the doctors were ready, medicine was ready to come in and argue that if we put everybody, all disabled people or people with impairments, into places like institutions, we could study the problems and we would be able to cure people. So there are a whole host of reasons why these institutions were built. By the time we got to the 1960s, it was clear that these were places where abuse was rife and they did not provide good homes for anyone. Jumping forward very quickly, interestingly, from the 1940s, actually, unmarried women would seen as sort of morally defective. Unmarried women who had children would be put in institutions too, particularly poor working class women, and would land up usually spending all of their lives in these institutions. Children aged 3 and onwards were also put in institutions, but from the late 1970s, they were no longer admitted. And in the 1980s, institutions were gradually run down. But it has been a huge task through a lot of my lifetime to change this situation. They do persist. I actually drove past Calderstone's Hospital a couple of weeks ago when my family was over at Easter, just because we were out that way having a look around, and I just wanted to see what happened. A lot of it had been knocked down. I was aware of that, and private housing is now on the site. But there's a large sign outside it saying Merseyside NHS Trust, which has gone up recently. And we still have some institutional arrangements there is a secure unit. So this is disabled people who have committed various crimes are put there, and there are assessment and treatment units as well in the UK, which are a continual problem, and they also persist through Europe. I spent a bit of time looking at this because I think it's important to situate the development of the social model in this context. The medical model of disability, as it persisted in institutions and other services, basically says that, or holds that, to simplify it greatly, that if you have an impairment or disability, this causes your lack of participation in society. On the right-hand side of the screen, I have a photo, it's quite an old one, it was taken in the 1920s, of 2 doctors in white coats inspecting a young boy of about 12 years old who is naked except for some shoes, and they're examining his body with various instruments. And I think not only does it say something about the way that the focus on the body, and the focus is on the body and what's wrong with people, but it also is a powerful image of inequality and the way that the boy is naked, but yet the grown men have doctors' uniforms and the trappings of status with them. So more recently, Ray and Stuart mentioned yesterday, which is your work with Greater Manchester Coalition of Disabled People. And I've taken this from their website with their permission to sort of bring it up to date, really. And this is how they would summarize how the medical model of disability works. I've got a in the middle of the circle, it states the disabled person is the problem. And here are some ways that disabled people are seen as a problem, that they're not the same as normal people. They're fundamentally different. Things like can't use stairs, housebound, can't use public transport, unsafe in society, can't communicate because they can't walk, see or hear, that they're a drain on society, that they're a scrounger, and that they're too problematic for maintaining at all. We can think of many other examples, but basically it's saying that the difficulty is with the person. So the medical model of disability has also been called, in some of the literature, some of the historical literature, the individual model. It's also been called an administrative model, less so these days, but those other terms exist if you come across them. So this is really what was being challenged, if you like, by disabled people. So where the social model developed, on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a large house. If people with learning difficulties or cognitive impairments or whatever were often put in very large institutions, often people with physical impairments were put in slightly smaller, but nevertheless large houses, which were similarly institutions, often with about 30 people there. They were not family-like arrangements. They were dormitories and often placed within these large houses. The Union of Physically Impaired Against Segregation, a bit of a long title, but was often termed UPIAS, was founded in 1972 by one of the residents of a home, Paul Hunt, and others in the UK. Paul Hunt lived in the Leonard Cheshire Le Court home, and he wrote that in a very pioneering paper in 1966, that disabled people were seen as unfortunate, useless, different, oppressed, and sick. And he said, what I am rejecting is society's tendency to set up rigid standards of what is right and proper to force the individual into a mold. Paul Hunt put an article in The Guardian, which is a daily newspaper, calling for others to see if they were interested in forming an organisation to try and do something about the situation of disabled people. And he received a number of replies, and they held a first meeting of UPIAS. Interestingly, the members of UPIAS, one of whom was Vic Finkelstein, I mentioned earlier, but many of the members were incognito. They kept their identities secret so that they didn't get reprisals from the staff of the institutions, who often had total control. UPIAS made a key distinction between a person's physical, psychological, or other condition and the way that they're treated in society. So it's not denying impairment or disability, but it was saying that this isn't the cause of the poor treatment. The social model of disability, in comparison with the medical model, draws a clear distinction between impairment and disability. And UPIAS defined impairment as lacking part of or all of a limb, or having a defective limb, organ, or mechanism of the body. Now, this is quite old-fashioned terminology. I'll come on to that in the second part of the presentation. It was raised yesterday too. But it basically says impairment, what they meant by impairment was the physical condition or physical or other condition of the person. Disability, on the other hand, was defined as nothing to do with impairment, but something imposed on top of our impairments by the way we are unnecessarily isolated and excluded from full participation in society. disabled people are therefore an oppressed group in society. They set out these principles in something called the Fundamental Principles of Disability, and you can see this original document on the Disability Archive, which, as mentioned yesterday, has a lot of historical documents. But this is very different from some other definitions. So disability in this sense hasn't actually got anything to do with impairment. It means that it's the way that society organizes things. Therefore, when we say in the UK disabled people, we're not talking about people with impairments. We're talking about people who are disabled by society using this term. This definition was an attempt to take a word that was often seen as a word of abuse or a really negative term and reclaim it by disabled people and used in a different way. Okay. So the social model, again, is described by the Greater Manchester Coalition of Disabled People as being the problem is how society is arranged rather than a disabled person. And they have a number of examples. A problem is if there are only stairs with no ramps or lifts for people with mobility impairments, inaccessible buildings and housing, inaccessible public transport, over-the-top health and safety, lack of sign language interpreters or accessible formats, multiple barriers to employment, segregated school, discrimination and segregation. So problems in society, those things are not to do necessarily with impairments. They're problems in the way that society is organized. Okay, what are we on now? 9. Okay, so let me just go on. And I looked up some national legal definitions of disability just out of interest to see how people were defined. And I didn't do all of them, but I looked up, for example, Sweden. In the Discrimination Act 2008, disability is described as a permanent physical, mental, or intellectual limitation of a person's functional capacity that as a consequence of injury or illness existed at birth, has arisen since then, or can be expected to arise. So in Sweden, clearly, the word disability is used to describe impairment, as we do. In France, however, disability is described as any limitations in participating in society because of a substantial permanent condition affecting a person's physical, sensory, or mental functioning, includes cognitive, etc. So in France, there's a more explicit link to a medical model understanding where the limitations of participation are due to the condition or impairment. In the UK, the word impairment is entered into the language a bit more. So although it's not quite a social model understanding, so a person that has a disability, if they have a physical or mental impairment, and the impairment has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on the person's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. So kind of going back to thinking about the social model as a model, it's not a theory. It's just if we would put a social model understanding on some of these definitions, it allows us to draw distinctions and to see the different kinds of understandings that there are in these definitions. And we can do that with many other things too. Okay, so maybe it's not the words that matter most, but it's the concept, it's the idea of understanding what it is that the social model is trying to do. Right, I'm going to come back to that. I think what I'd like to do is just pause there and ask if there are any kind of questions or if anything's not very clear, rather than going all the way through with the rest of the presentation. Could I just check? for your comments or thoughts. Doesn't have to be questions.
I have one question. Thank you, Sarah. This is super interesting. I'm also wondering, yesterday we heard Anna talk. To what extent do you also see that legal definitions and in general the whole language is linked to the ratification of the convention?
Mm. The convention was quite explicit in a way on it has on kind of incorporating the social model. So you see, as Anna said yesterday, you know, that was explicit, that in terms of the convention. So you have it is largely, Anna will be able to tell you, as she was involved in some of the discussions. Also a Leeds colleague, Gerard Quinn, could, if he had time, he is the UN rapporteur, to describe it. But there was quite a bit of discussion about it. It uses the term persons with disabilities, which we'll come on to. That is prevalent in America, and there and many countries in Europe too. But it does understand the notion, you know, the importance of discrimination and oppression, and tries to open up equality of opportunity to disabled people. Does that answer the question? You will see a lot of muddles.
Yeah. Mm.
There's a lot of muddle as well in the World Health Organization definition too, where there was a huge fight over that, and about redefining it went on for ages, and they tried to incorporate some social model understanding into their three-way definition of disability. I won't go into that now, but it's a kind of hybrid between a medical and social model, but it has been extremely influential, you know, into in influencing policy, as well as really the disabled people's movement, and such as Greater Manchester Coalition and many others too, but more or less successfully incorporated into treaties and laws.
I'd like to also comment, Sarah, that it becomes even more complex when there are different terminology, different words, of course, in different languages, and it becomes quite problematic. I think in Sweden, a lot of these legal documents talk about funktionsnedsättning, which means that the function is impaired or reduced. And then they have the word funktionshinder, which means function barriered. So I think disability perhaps relates to funktionshinder, and impairment probably funktionsnedsättning, but I'm not sure. But it's quite fascinating to read even official documents and see what their underlying perspective is. And yes, when you read them, you think it's all right and proper, but when you break it down and decompose the formulations, it becomes, you can see that although the intention is good and the wording is good, but when you read it, it becomes the medical model sometimes as well.
Yes.
Corinne has some comments on the chat, but go ahead, Corinne, please.
Yeah, very interesting. Thanks a lot for all those explanations. And it's clear that in France, we are quite late on the topic, and we follow, I mean, the definition of the World Health Organization. So it means that it's very medical oriented, as you said. And what is interesting as well is that the wording, let's say, used for people with disabilities is different from a sector to another in France. So, for example, in the cultural sector and in the museums, even, I mean, when you see all the dedicated activities wanted to reach, I mean, people with disabilities, the title, the term, the vocabulary used is different from museums, for example, to another. So sometimes it's people at risk of exclusion, or sometimes it's disabled people, or sometimes it's people with disabilities, or sometimes it's very direct wording, blind people, you know. So there is not even in some sectors a specific or a common language, and it's yeah, so it's very, very difficult, yeah, to find the good wording, trying to avoid any bias, you know, any yeah, problematic language.
I do agree with you. I think it's the same everywhere. We see very patchy and sort of partial kind of interpretations, and I just kind of, yeah, I think different sectors, different understandings, different. So I think what I wanted to say, and you rightly point out, is that in thinking about it as a historical development, it's important to kind of understand where it came from, but it's sort of still with us today. And it's, you know, it's definitions is one thing, but we can also look at other arrangements and sort of accessibility and other issues. I realize I can't go back on these slides for some reason to the previous slide, which was about the social model. So I'm stuck on these national legal definitions. It was just an aside, really. I kind of more wanted to focus on the on the social model as a kind of more general thing. Are there others, or can I go on? Or I haven't looked at the chat.
You have covered the chat, but I think
there was a comment from Femke, I think, saying she'd like to.
Okay, add some.
Yes, please.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, to me, it's so interesting. And I noticed that what you describe is, from a lived experience point of view, it's the thing you can sense underneath. And it's so hard to pinpoint, but it's really in the relationship I have had with many caretakers helping me out to live with deaf blindness. There often was this feeling of a little uncomfortable, and I just couldn't pinpoint it. And listening to you, I think, okay, this is it. This is what you still sense, and it's really something inside the history, actually.
Yeah.
But we both are not aware about it. I can sense it, but I'm not aware about the background. And I'm sure most caretakers are not aware about it. So it's so deeply hidden. Well, this is the one thing I would like to share. Like, okay, I feel this when I listen to you, I feel it's doing something with me, but that is because it's connected to this feeling of uncomfortable. And the other thing I want to say is, with ADBN, Acquired Deafblind Network, we had a lot of discussions about also the medical and the social model. And at some point we came to, okay, we really need both of them. We do need the medical, because you need to set limits, like, okay, because without the medical, you cannot make the social model work. So to me, it's not something negative alone. It's also something that's justify certain advantages I need, but I also I'm really grateful to accept that come with the social model. So that are two comments I would like to share.
Thank you so much, and they're really important comments. I really agree. Just to respond to a couple of them, I sat here last night thinking, have I got time to cover this? Haven't I got time to cover this in the talk? And I decided I didn't. But there was something I would point you to, and that feeling of discomfort, and, you know, the kind of attitudes of people, there is some work that really important originated in Scandinavia by that were I think, you know, for those people, sorry, just thinking for those people who are academic and kind of want to look at this, Bengt Nerje and Niels Bank Mikkelsen were kind of early pioneers in Sweden and Denmark, who developed something called the theory of normalization. I know about the word. Some of these words are very awful. It was taken up by Wolf Wolfensberger in America, who developed the principle of normalization, and he later developed it with Susan Thomas into something called social role valorization. These are really wordy, jargony things, I know. But one of the things Wolf talked about really firmly and put way on the agenda was the power of the unconscious. These are unconscious things. These are really, these attitudes that are developed sort of in childhood amongst people. You know, there's evidence that young children don't discriminate, but by the age of 8, we learn to place value on things. These are deeply held beliefs, and they're not easy to unroot. And so we think we're all good. We know this stuff about disability, but all of us in it have it in us, you know, this kind of discrimination, and whether we do it to ourselves or to other people, you know, about who we value, who we don't. These are powerfully held beliefs, and so they may not articulate them, but you can sense it in people. It's very hard. I know my work, it's previous to academia, this is so. But I would point you in their direction. There's some fascinating work that, say, Wolf wrote about. It's still on a terrible old language, I must say. The origin and nature of our institutional models. What we, you know, we locked people up in these places because there were certain beliefs about them, and so on and so forth. Anyway, I'm not really gone into that, but these. You know, and these are things that we can challenge, if you like. That's why it's so important to shut. There's a second one about the medical and social model. I think that the early social modelists didn't dare put in anything about medicine because, and they didn't dare because it was so prevalent, you know, so they just totally ignored it. More recently, people have turned around and applied the social model to medicine and say, actually, we're not getting the health care. You know, we're not getting this, the recent research, sorry, and this is going on to the second part of my talk, but I'll skip over it because we're covering it now. You know, people have looked at medicine and say, you know, actually we need access to medicine, we need access, but the problem is that we're not getting it on the same basis as non-disabled people. And recent research has showed that. So yes, you of course you need it, but I think in the early days they were scared of bringing back the kind of medical approach, so they kind of said no. But yeah, does that respond, Femke, to your question? Thank you. I'd love to discuss it further. Shall I go on?
So there was a hand up. I don't know, Sophia, if your question was quick or not.
Sarah answered my question. I just had this reflection that the exact same historical procedures happened in Sweden with institutionalizing everyone that wasn't part of the norm, and then simply, especially in the 1990s with the economic crisis, people were just let out, and that wasn't right either, because you have a right to care, to medicine. You have a right to not just be ignored or forgotten by society. So yeah, yes. That was my reflection.
Yes, the deinstitutionalization was equally as problematic here too. People were deemed to belong to certain authorities. So you had, say, people who'd formed, one couple that I knew who'd formed a romantic relationship. They wanted to get married, but while they were living in the institution, but it was decided that they belonged to different local authorities. So they were sent back supposedly to different parts of the country. I mean, it was a mess, you know, the way that it was done. It was appalling, and some people were turfed out on the streets, and again, very, very bad too. Sweden, mass sterilization was a problem too, of disabled people, yeah, as it was in some other countries as well.
So there was a comment. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it, please.
There was a comment about the references to the names that you mentioned, but maybe you can send them to me later and I will share
Yes, I
it with
will.
colleagues.
I will.
Great.
That's for sure. That's for sure. Shall I go on? I'm sorry, I've just realised I'm so interested to talk, but I'll briefly go through some other issues. Oh, wait, why is it not? Sorry. My slide seems to have stalled. Let me just see if I can get it back. Pause share. Resume share. That's great. Is it sharing?
Yes.
Right. Why can't I see it myself? A slight technical problem.
You need to be in PowerPoint, because I know I had this problem.
Did you?
Yesterday, where I ended up with the Zoom overlay visible on Windows.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Thank you. I've just clicked on it. Thank you so much, Ray. Sounds, I think they've introduced something. Anyway, briefly, I will, okay, I want to talk about another angle too. The social model is not the only influence, if you like. There are a lot of other influences too, in terms of kind of improving things. And in America, the independent living movement was founded by Ed Roberts, who was a student in the 1960s. Again, some of you will know this. Picture of Ed Roberts on the right hand of the screen, as an older person in his
Sorry,
40s.
Sarah, we still see the national legal definition of disability. So,
okay, thank you for telling me that. Let me try. Sorry. Oh, okay. Resume share.
yes, now it's fine.
Is that working now?
Yes.
Phew, thank you. Okay. So Ed Roberts, a student in the 1960s, he had polio, and as a consequence, had very little movement. He could move a couple of fingers and some toes. Following various battles with education, he was admitted to Berkeley University, University of California at Berkeley, and there set up an organization, well, didn't set up an organization, but he developed support for himself, and more students joined. As a result, it led to the first Center for Independent Living, which provided individual support to people at Berkeley, and then later more widely in communities. He was very, very much a pioneer. He founded the World Institute on Disability with Judy Heumann. He also returned to run the first Center for Independent Living, and also became director of the Department for Rehabilitation, which was an organization that had said that he couldn't have support originally because he was unlikely to work, and so on and so forth. So it's been a hugely influential, including in the UK, and I think across Europe, this establishing individualized support for people to do what they want in terms of education, work, and living. So I just mentioned that. I've skirted over it a bit quickly. Now to jump to some critiques of the social model. There have been critiques from academia as its influence. It's been very successful, but influence spread to new disciplines and area of study. It's been criticized for various things. not covering enough ground, for example, leaving out discussion of cultural imagery, personal experiences, and the effects of impairment. So people have said it doesn't cover enough, it should cover more things. It's sometimes been critiqued as a theory rather than as a model. And that's why I kind of mentioned the difference between those two things. And I think that as it's moved into news, as people in different subject areas have taken it up, I think this kind of lack of explanatory power, because it's a model, has been subject to criticism. To my mind, this is my own view, that critiques have often been bound up with the competitive demands of the academic environment. Academics often afford, you have to prove that you're saying something new, that you're critiquing something. And we've had some very fierce and heated debates about the social model. And some of it, I think, is due to the need to show that you're saying something different, you're saying something new. It's not always the ideas, but the context. And then also some of the radical implications have sometimes been lost. As the social model's been used to inform legal treaties and government policy, it's sometimes been watered down to say it means inclusion and participation. It's actually saying more than that. It's not about including people in what's going on already, but it's also about transforming society so that disabled people are part of it. Now, inclusion is interpreted or described in very broad ways. That must be said. For some people, it's just about accessibility and including people in there. Other people, it is actually about transforming society so that it is more accommodating. But it has been watered down to some extent. Critical disabilities, I'm going to jump through these. Critical disability studies, what is this? How is it different from disability studies? If disability studies was really pretty much founded on the social model, as Anna described yesterday, in terms of the work of CDS, critical disability studies, it kind of broadly refers to postmodern approaches to theorizing disability. And authors are often critical of the materialist approaches that underpinned the development of the social model and disability studies. It also very explicitly links the study of disability to cultural studies, cultural sociology, developed from the 1960s onwards. And certainly at the moment, intersectionality is an important strand, taking into account diverse identities, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, just as in the women's movement, kind of differences between women became an important focal point. That's the case too in disability studies. A new focus on the body and its intersection with technology is characteristic, and it is also more academic and less explicitly linked to disabled people's organizations. So, okay, I mean, that's very brief, but these are some of the characteristics of critical disability studies versus disability studies as I see them. Ableism is another word that you will come across. It's used in several different ways in the academic literature. And I think I have to conclude that mostly it's used to mean the same thing as disableism or disability in the literature. And what we mean by it is a deeply ingrained preference for certain abilities. Fiona Kumari Campbell describes it as a network of beliefs, processes, and practices that produce a particular kind of self and body, corporeal standard, that's projected as the perfect, species typical, and therefore essential and fully human. So disability is a diminished state of being human. I say mostly people use it to refer to disability or disableism, but it's deeply ingrained, it's deeply ingrained in all of us. I've rather whimsically included a picture on the right-hand side of the screen of some graduates, just to say, we're all implicated in this, of valuing certain abilities over other abilities. If we think about ableism and we turn the lens on dismantling the structures whereby we value abilities, it's profoundly challenging. And I think this is why people have reverted to using it to mean disableism rather than focusing on dismantling ableism. Crip theory, I'm running slightly over time. Is that okay, Nasreen?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry about this.
Yeah.
I'll speed up. Crip theory, crip is short for cripple. It refers to people with mobility impairments, and it's a term of abuse in general speech, so we don't use it. Disabled people use crip, a shortened version, is a way of reclaiming derogatory words and asserting their own value. So I would not use the word crip, never use the word crip of a person. A couple of authors that I can point you towards. Robert McClure links the interdependence of heterosexuality, able-bodiedness, and normality. He talks about compulsory able-bodiedness and compulsory heterosexuality work together in relation to the family, school, and workplace. Kind of fairly classic work there. Hamre and Frisch, you might be interested to see their work actually, because they are looking at cryptechnoscience. But they describe it as the non-compliant anti-assimilationist position that disability is a desirable part of the world. They're using the term disability in terms of impairment there. That's very briefly crip theory. I think I'll skip over, is it with your permission, commonality and difference, although we can come back to talk about that. And just to pick up on the terminology, it matters because we it says things about people and describes our attitudes to people, and it's powerfully linked to culture. So Nasreen's brought up that what we might say disabled people in the UK, and I've described why we do that, but also in many countries of the world, the USA, many parts of Europe, the term people with disabilities is preferred. And we must respect that, I think, because it is linked to culture, and meanings are linked to culture. And I think in Europe, many people are quite comfortable with the fact that, we describe people differently and we mean things differently by it. And that's just fine because it's linked to the culture. Certainly meanings change over time. So they often take on negative meanings, and we can see disabled people reclaiming language, such as MAD studies or crip theory, to challenge the negativity attached to it. Resolving terminology issues. I mean, we'll be quite familiar with this. I mean, we resolve it obviously in terms of our own cultures, but also in terms of how people want to be described, to ask people, what is the best way of doing this? In the UK, for example, people with learning difficulties want to be called people with learning difficulties. Their organisations say this. The health service calls them people with learning disabilities, so that if you see that term, it's probably written by somebody from the services, but it's difficulties if you ask people themselves. It is complicated, but I think we must live with different terminology. I want to conclude by just thinking a little bit about disability in the arts, which goes a bit beyond what the brief is, I know, but thinking about the social model and so on, many years, disabled people's sense of aesthetics was not recognised and people didn't have access to it. Art therapy or music therapy, sometimes the arts have been seen as not something to be enjoyed for themselves, but as a means of fixing or curing people. So you give it to people as therapy instead of for enjoyment. Participation, which is why MuseIT is so important, is so that people can participate. And also representation has been a big issue. in the arts. So for many years we've had non-disabled actors playing disabled people, or the way that people are depicted as usually evil. It's usually the baddie has the impairment and so on. It challenged in recent years. And finally, I would just point you to Disability Arts Online. This is it's UK-based resource, but there are resources in all countries worldwide, including Europe. I noticed last night there's a big conference coming up on this on May the 28th, which you might be interested just to have a look at. There's a thriving disabled people-led arts community, theatre, music, all kinds of arts, developed as an alternative to some of the exclusion experienced from the kind of mainstream art movement. Anyway, it's a resource there. I've skipped over some things, but I think I'll stop there. And apologies for going slightly over the allotted time. Oops. And there's some references which may be useful if you want to follow up on some stuff.